Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Aurelius podcast. We have Andy Budd this time around of Clearleft, a digital product and service design agency based in the UK. Andy and I covered quite a lot of ground, and we talked about some of the beginnings of Clearleft and how and why they started that agency, and even how the relationship has changed between, the work that they do and their clients. And Andy, like me, has a great appreciation for using analogy in describing some things in design. So we had some fun with stuff like that. But our conversation kept coming back to this idea of doing proper research and really sitting with the data, analyzing it, synthesizing it, turning it into insights to get to design. And Andy has a lot of great information and tips on how we do that in a very tactical way. And this is also a really good point for me to bring up for you folks that we recently launched Aurelius version 2 into beta. And that is a user research and insights platform for design and product teams. Exactly folks like you listening to this podcast. We're in beta right now. You can actually sign up to get access on our homepage. You go ahead to www.aureliuslab.com. That is AURELIUSLAB.com. If you go ahead over there, sign up, I'll be sure to get you an invite, and you can come check us out and let us know if we're helping you do better research and synthesis. But with that, on to the show. Welcome to Aurelius Podcast, episode 13 with Andy Budd, CEO and co-founder at Clearleft, a digital product and service design agency based in the UK. Andy, welcome to the show.
So glad to be here, man. Really looking forward to our chat.
I am as well. So, Andy and I were chatting just a bit before we actually started here, and I had actually had a chance to run into Andy many, many years ago with the now Deep Sixth Idea Conference, but back in Philadelphia, and so not only is Andy a prolific designer, especially based in the UK, as well as around the world, but he is also a speaker and author. And so we're really glad to have you here to share some of your thoughts with the folks who listen to the podcast.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that conference because I had a blast there. And Philly is such a great city. I mean, I've long been a fan of Philly through the work of folks like Happy Cog and Dan Mall. So it was a real pleasure to get there, to kind of like wander the streets, to see the town. Didn't have any chili cheesesteak because I'm a vegetarian, but I watched on as my friends enjoyed it. And it was a really fun conference. It's a shame it only had a couple of runs, but yeah, very nice to kind of finally connect after all these years. Must be 5 or 6 years, I reckon.
I would think so. Yeah, I think that's right. Well,
it's also very kind of you to say that I'm a well-renowned designer. I think these days I spend more of my time sending emails and sitting in meetings and having coffees with people than actually doing any work in anger. But yeah, it's nice to see that myth of me still having some kind of creativity left is still going around. So thanks for that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, at least certainly in my eyes, and I would suspect a great many others. So. No, that's awesome. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about the work that you are doing these days before we kind of dive into the meatier stuff?
Sure. I mean, so as you said, I run an agency called Clearleft. We started in the UK around 2005. We started in a time when design was still very immature, particularly digital design. Most design projects started with opening up Photoshop, moving things around, making them look pretty. I came from a background where that just really seemed crazy to me. It was unscientific. So before starting Clearleft, I was working in an agency where I was doing information architecture and doing user research and doing usability testing and all of the sort of elements and components that effectively sort of merged into this sort of emerging discipline of UX design. At the time, there wasn't really a name for it, but around 2004, 2005, friends of ours in Adaptive Path started sort of popularizing this sort of movement that was sort of coming out of the tech companies of San Francisco and Silicon Valley. And we just realized that this was the way forward, that we wanted to try and bring a user centricity to projects. So rather than just focusing on the client needs, we wanted to focus on the user needs because we felt that by satisfying the user needs, you'd meet the client's needs. And also we didn't like the idea of just, the blank page and focusing design purely on inspiration. Design, in my book, particularly digital design, is there to solve a problem, a human problem, a business problem. And so we looked around and we couldn't see anybody else in the UK doing that. So we started Clearleft. I don't know if we are technically the first UX agency in the UK, but we're definitely the first that we were aware of. And the early days, it was really tough trying to push UX as a practice, because our clients would be, well, what the hell is UX and why are you charging us a week? But slowly we kind of pushed it forwards, and through our public speaking and through the books that we've written and through the conferences we've organized, we've kind of helped, one of many people, but have had a field. And so now our clients come to us usually already understanding the field, understanding the discipline, understanding the need to talk to users, understanding the need to kind of talk to stakeholders and bring all this stuff together. And so really this is designing products and services for people. We tend not to work in the marketing space. We tend not to do micro sites or sites to promote, drinking more fizzy drinks or more sugary snacks. Our focus is really trying to help people design better tools and better services. And so that's kind of what we do. Over the last 18 months, we've helped companies like Virgin Holidays, who are a big travel brand in the UK, John Lewis, who are a big superstore. I guess they're similar to like I don't know, a Macy's or a Nordstrom or something, I guess. We've worked with, a whole bunch of interesting kind of retailers, app manufacturers. Penguin Books is a company that we spent quite a lot of time working with. So yeah, just, everything from kind of small startups to kind of fairly big companies, trying to help them improve their products and services. And I think what we've found over the last few years, being an agency, is the nature of the agency relationship has changed. And I think we've stopped doing mostly standalone projects. We've stopped just kind of like having work thrown over the fence, delivering it and throwing it back. And a lot more of our work nowadays is working with in-house teams to help supercharge them, to help coach them, to help push them forwards. And the ideal is all the skills and capability they need to pick that project up and run with it. Because I think previous to that, the agency with the product stopped as well. As soon as it was done, it was handed over and then it atrophied for 3 or 4 years. And now what we're trying to encourage is internal teams to take ownership, to move forwards, to constantly improve and tweak. And so when that happens, when we hand the baton over to the designers we've been working with and they run with it, we get a huge sense of satisfaction. And we know that project is in good hands, is going to live on, and grow. And
fascinating story, not only of how Clearleft began, but as well as how you're evolving now. It's interesting too. Peter Merholtz on our show, one of the co-founders of Adaptive Path. And I want to tie this together because something you said early on and how you think about design is very much more simple inspiration or creativity. And a lot of us would agree. And I say us being those of us here at Aurelius, and of course, those who I believe listen to our podcast. And, one of the things Peter and I talked about was, Peter said he takes a sort of lawyer-like approach to design, where essentially you're gathering all the evidence you can to present a case that you believe best meets that need, best solves that problem. And that's just simply the approach that you take. I
was just going to say, I often use the metaphor not so much of a lawyer, but of a detective in a kind of Scandi noir kind of sort of fiction program. Because a lot of it is it's sifting the evidence, it's sticking it all up on the wall, it's absorbing it, it's making those connections. And I kind of joke that, like, if you're hiring a designer, if it's a good designer, their workspace should look like a murder's happened. And if you're a bad designer, it should look clinically clean. The other thing I think is really relevant is, like, with these kind of like, TV crime movies, there's always like the jaded old cop that's always done it this way and will never change. I would always jump to the most obvious conclusion, the most obvious kind of criminal, and not, they'd get their person, and then, the story will plan out that it's clearly not that person. And I think we see that a lot. A lot of agencies, a lot of designers jump to the most obvious solution. But the most obvious solution isn't necessarily the best solution. Often it's the worst solution because it's the most obvious one, because it's somewhere they've seen before. And I think by bathing in this information and by letting yourself follow these clues and these threads and these trends, what ends up happening is you end up being more generative and you deliver more and more and more and more ideas. And then once you've got a whole bunch of potential candidates or potential felons, then you can go through and you can kind of discount them one by one until you're left with the one that is the best fit for solving the problem. So I love that kind of, and frankly I prefer to see myself more as a kind of as a hard boiled detective than a lawyer. So yeah, that would be my pitch.
Anybody who knows me knows that I absolutely love the use of analogy, both in illustrating design, but just general concepts. So I kind of want to keep running with this with you, if you don't mind. Okay. And so you talk about really gathering the evidence and sifting through this information and filtering that. Talk a little bit more about what that means in practically applied terms for us as an industry.
Yeah, sure thing. The first stage of any engagement with Clearleft is usually some kind of immersion phase, discovery phase, pilot project, whatever you will call it. And that typically will take 3 parts. The first part, and usually, because of time and budget, a lot of these things break down into kind of 6-week blocks. So quite often the initial discovery phase would be 6-week-long sprints. The first 2 weeks would typically be that evidence gathering. We'd start by some desk research. It might be looking at analytics. It might be looking at any user research they've done already, if they've created personas, if they have some data on performance, etc. They've, like most organizations now, they probably commissioned some great piece of strategy 18 months ago, and it's been sat in a PowerPoint deck ever since. So try and pull that out. And once we start to get a bit of a flavor of what they know, that also helps inform what the gaps are and what they don't know or might think they know. But typically before talking to users and customers, we'll start by interviewing stakeholders. We'll try and build a list of representative stakeholders. Clearly, we want to talk to the people who are actually, we're solving their business problem, but also we want to talk to the people who are going to be affected by the result of this new product or service. They might be the people using it, maintaining it, building it, marketing it, etc. And also we want to talk to the people who are the head of the organization to understand how the product or service fits in with their broader goals. A lot of businesses kind of push back and will go, well, we already know all this stuff. But you'll be amazed, like when you get a group of people, there's a tendency for everyone to agree. Once you actually get people on their own, you're much more likely to understand where the differences are and where the different goals are. And actually, spending time with a finance director, they're going to have a very different outlook of what they want to get than the head of marketing or the head of design or the head of technology. And so, sort of separating these people off and finding out what they really need to achieve and what will make them feel good and what will make them look good as well. Because again, a lot of this stuff, you've got the organizational needs, then you've got the individual stakeholder needs. And if you're not satisfying the stakeholders, then they're going to be frustrated. They're going to be potentially blocking what you're trying to do. So trying to bring all these people along on the journey. And once we try to gather this information, once we know what the organization are trying to achieve, we'll often kind of do the same process and go out and talk to prospective customers. And yeah, one-on-one conversations, maybe backed up with some surveys. Possibly if it's an existing product or service, we might do some usability testing, or we might do some mirroring or kind of really light ethnography to understand what their frustrations are and what their issues are. We might do a bit of user journeys and map the pain points. And then we'll probably take the information and the insights we've gathered from talking to the users, play those back to the customers or the clients and say, well, look, you thought the problem was X. Actually, we've done our analysis and we think the problem is X, but it's also Y and Z. You have a belief that this thing is working really well, but actually our studies have shown that you've got bigger problems here, here, and here. And by having that conversation and by surfacing that information, then you get a much broader picture of what's wrong. And once we've got this understanding, then we can kind of start working with our customers or sometimes with their users to start exploring potential solutions. That might be through workshopping, co-design, sketching exercises, or it might be through us just kind of using our brain power to kind of prototype really, really quickly and then present that back and iterate, etc. But basically coming up with hypotheses and then try to test those hypotheses out as quickly as possible. to make sure that the thing we're designing actually kind of meets as many needs as we can. The challenge always is that, it's never possible to create a product or service that does everything for everybody. So there's always compromises. But I think by understanding what those compromises are and by going in with your eyes open, then you save a lot of problems later on. Like a Benjamin Johnson or whatever said, something along the lines of, plans are useless, but planning is vital. And I think that's for us as well. The planning process is the important thing. It's not the output. It's not the doc. So we tend to have a very loose approach to project management. Like we don't have a Clearleft trademarked kind of diagram that has little kind of squiggles and, lines and what have you. It's about asking questions, responding to those questions, gaining understanding and insight, and then using that knowledge to level up and then ask the next question and solve the next problem. And so, but going back to your conversation with Peter, like most agencies, at the end of the day, most designers, we kind of sort of use the double diamond kind of approach to design, which is going broad and going narrow, asking questions, exploring, and then you get discovery and asking questions. The next 2 weeks would be bathing in the information and understanding it and making some matching. And then the last 2 weeks would be nailing that down into some kind of proposal, some kind of concept, some kind of tangible thing that we can. Design thinking comes in, and people would argue whether design thinking is a thing or whether it's emperor's new clothes, and I'm not really interested in that debate. But I think a lot of the tools that people do use when they claim they're using design thinking are tools that other people use as well. They're good analytical problem solving skills. I think the key thing that designers can add is the ability of manifesting that in a visual way. So rather than coming back to your client with a written proposal or a PowerPoint deck with lots of really badly typographed kind of, like arrows pointing everywhere, coming back with something that is much more tangible, a poster, a video, a design concept, something that you can, is still rough, you can still pull it to bits, but something that is solid enough that everyone can look at it and go, that's what I wanted, or that isn't what I wanted, or I can see problems here or problems there. And so manifesting conceptual business problems in a visual way, I think is one of the best powers that designers and design thinking can bring to the problem. So that's what we try and do.
Yeah, I actually really very much appreciate personally the fact that you describe your approach as less about steps in a process that we take and more about a philosophy. That, hey, we want to ask some questions, we want to understand the meaning of those questions, and then make the best adjustments in course or proper next steps from what we learn, rather than having a constrained process to ourselves. And
well, I mean, I think I was going to say, I do think project management is really important, but in an agency setting, and maybe internally as well, I think project management is kind of like an industrialized process. The purpose of having really, really rigorous project management is to ensure that whatever you put in, you get a consistent and timely output. And so if your goal is consistency, having a rigid project management process makes sense. Like if you're building an oil rig, you want to make absolutely sure that it's not going to blow up, and you want to make absolutely sure it's going to be delivered on time. I think when you're doing something creative, consistency is less important than quality. And when you're focusing on quality, I think project management actually, it manages replicability, but it doesn't encourage getting that extra 20%. So I think a lot of agencies have a really rigid process, partly because they hire very junior people, and those junior people only know 1 or 2 or 3 techniques. So they feed them into this process that says like, well, we absolutely have to use, insert prototyping tool, an insert design tool, and insert this, and you do this, 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 and this. And very junior teams can very quickly understand that process. With Clearleft, we're not wanting to kind of efficiently deliver the 80%. We're more concerned about the last 20%. And to do that, you need to hire smart people that have a whole toolbox of tools and know when to use those tools. And also, if that's the case, and if you want to have the best people use the right tools, you can't tell them what tools to use 3 months in advance before you even know what the problem is. It's kind of like phoning up a plumber and saying, look, I want you to come around and fix my boiler, but I want you to use a wrench and a hammer and a this and a that. And the plumber's like, well, I don't even know what the problem is. You can't decide on that. And so we're trying to maximize the optimal potential rather than sort of minimize, kind of variance and maximize consistency. And that's what really excites us. But the challenge with that is you can't do that at scale. We're a small agency. We're 30 people. We're never going to be a 500-person company. If you're a 500-person company or a 5,000-person company, you need governance and you need process in place, because there aren't 5,000 amazing UX designers that have been doing this for 15 years. So you need to figure out ways of leveling people up. So we're quite fortunate of having those experienced people that don't need so much in the way of rails, I guess.
I want to take a moment and go way back to something earlier when we were using the detective film noir, hard-boiled sort of scenarios. Much of it comes into gathering that evidence and sifting through it, and with that a little bit more, and just, I would ask directly, how do we make sense of this that we gather, both in the conversations with our customers or clients or stakeholders, as well as the prospective customers or users of the product or service we're designing for?
In kind of sort of, I guess it's philosophy. There are three modes of thinking. You have deductive reasoning, which is kind of effectively the mode that scientists use. It's very logical. It's very kind of linear. And actually, this is typically how you see dev teams working, how technical people working. They work in a very deductive way. You have inductive reasoning, which is much more around looking at patterns and looking at statistics and kind of measuring kind of like probabilities. And that's kind of very sort of the business way of kind of looking at stuff. But then you have a kind of a third mode of thinking, which is, oh God, I've forgotten the name now. It's terrible. It was on the tip of my tongue a second ago.
Abductive.
Inductive, deductive, abductive, yeah. You've got abductive reasoning, which is kind of typically the mode that the designers use. And actually, I think it's the mode that design thinking is based around. And I typically define design thinking as effectively the use of abductive thinking along with the tools and techniques that designers have developed over the years to kind of understand and explore this space, plus the making of this information visible. And I think it's the making of the information visible that allows the abductive process, because effectively what you do is you take this information and you internalize it, which is actually one of the reasons why I think it's important for designers to do their own research. It's the same as people maybe sometimes use this as a false equivalence, but I think designers not doing their own research is the same as designers trying to get the benefit of a holiday by reading the postcard that their friend sent back from their holiday. Because I think you need to internalize this stuff. And so I think you go through a process of discovery, you internalize it, you visualize it, and then these subconscious kind of adaptive processes start working through. They start spotting patterns. They start kind of making leaps of faith. And so it's kind of, that's why it's really difficult to kind of systematize and turn this into a process, because a lot of this stuff is kind of subconscious. A lot of this stuff is based around years and years and years of training and spotting patterns and seeing what works and what doesn't. And so, like I say, I think it's just it's sifting the evidence. It's putting it all up in a visible place. It's spotting the patterns. It's getting little sparks of insight. It's trying things out and then seeing whether those work and those map to the model that you've kind of created. And so, yes, it's an abductive thinking process, which I think is at its key, I would argue.
So pleased to hear you discuss those three modes of thinking, because this was something that I personally researched in strategy work for design, and the thoughts around abductive thinking, where I was originally introduced to was via John Coco in his book and a lot of the things that he discussed there, and I thought that was very brilliant work. And so because we've got into this, what we do here at Aurelius, we are trying to help people make better sense of their user research and insights for design and product work, right? And the question I often get asked is, how do you make sense of this information? So we've touched on something here. It's a mode of thinking. Your favorite example of this kind of abductive thinking, where you yourself and your team perhaps have aha moment by sifting through this information and using that mode of thinking in some way?
That's a very good question. It's difficult to know whether the insights, I mean, again, so I should probably point out to your listeners that I am not a kind of a design philosopher. So, I don't have a deep kind of academic knowledge of different modes of thinking. It's just something that I'm kind of interested and curious in. And I genuinely believe that these modes of thinking tend to kind of reflect different disciplines in organizations, and you typically have the inductive thinkers who are designers, the inductive ones who are the marketing department, and the deductive ones who are tech. And actually I find that in a lot of organizations, one or two of those sort of ways of approaching the world are missing, and I think that makes the organization weaker for it. I can't necessarily sort of with any certainty say that this example I'm going to give you was a result of that abductive thinking, above and beyond the fact that I think that's the mode designers use in general. But we were recently tasked with redesigning Penguin books. So Penguin Random House, very, very large book company, merged. They found themselves with about 600 websites that they needed to turn into one website. So that's already a big information architecture project. They had loads of stakeholders, both internal, sometimes because they'd just merged, they were often people that had the same job title and maybe even thought they were doing the same thing, but that had come from the different organizations. And then we had the users, the customers, and authors. So it was a really, really big kind of complex stakeholder and user map. And so we go out and we sit and we talk to customers, we talk to authors, we talk to stakeholders, and we just start building this picture. And it just starts to become clear that they're never going to compete with Amazon. When you wake up in the morning, you think, I'm going to buy a book, I want to see a review. You don't think, I'm going to go to a publisher site. You think you're going to go to Amazon because people have been trained over many, many years. But we came to the realization that this organization, what they had is they had so much knowledge and passion about their domain, about their authors, about the topic that they were interested in. The people who were commissioning editors kind of knew everything about the history of the authors and what they were working on next and what they were working on in the past and where they were, etc. We kind of realized that would be a huge opportunity there. And so the kind of the pitch that we made back to Penguin effectively is like, we believe you should be the IMDb for your publishers. And rather than and then obviously through conversations, one of the challenges is that most of these companies have got small marketing teams, and producing original content was tough. And so it's like, well, rather than constantly producing original content, there's already loads of content out there. Why don't we try and pull this in from all the sources? So if your author goes on breakfast TV and speaks about their upcoming book, let's grab the video. If they've got a double page spread in The Guardian, let's pull that article in. If they're going to be talking at a local literary festival, let's bring that in. And let's make you the kind of the centre for excellence, the one-stop shop for any fan that wants to know about your products and services. And this came from lots of conversations. It came from understanding the need of the authors to communicate and connect with the audience. It came from understanding what and why audience members came to the site and also what they were frustrated by. And it came to an understanding of what the organization's business goals were. And none of these individual things in and of themselves would have been enough to suggest that suggestion. But all together, it just kind of sort of made sense that there was an opportunity there to solve that problem in a way that hadn't been kind of considered before, and so that's what we set out to do. And so it was a formative process. That the solution didn't come fully formed. It came, but the other thing is, like, one of the things I find weirdly is I think it's really easy for the designer to kind of place themselves at the center of the process and be the hero in their own hero's journey. And actually, the way I like to see design is much more like an archaeological dig. To go back to your idea of having kind of sort of concepts to explore. And I generally believe like the organisation and the authors and the customers at some deep level knew what the right solution was. They just couldn't articulate it, or they couldn't join it up. And so it required a team to come in with their spades and their shovels initially, a bit kind of aggressive and a bit kind of big and messy, and then, little trowels and then finally little dusty things to try and uncover this thing that was sitting there and staring them in their face. And weirdly, like I would imagine if we went back to the organisation now, the organisation, Penguin would go, well, clearly that was obviously what we wanted you to do, and you were really helpful in helping us deliver it, but we already knew this stuff. Because I think once you kind of like uncover this stuff, it just becomes obvious. But at the start, you don't know what's below the kind of subconscious or kind of hidden underground. So yeah, most of the time we're archaeologists. We're not coming up with genius ideas. We're just uncovering them and then presenting them back to the organisation in a way that they immediately get.
Yeah, that's a really fun story. I'm going to try to summarize some of the high points of what I think I heard you say, which is just very simply, we found a lot of the dusty bits that were already in their organization and knowledge that we had from their customers, and really connected the dots between those things where they otherwise may not have been able to.
Yes, I think that's a good analogy. Yeah, it was like these ideas were already present. We just had to facilitate the connecting of them. Yeah.
That's a very interesting concept. And I was asked, we're afraid that we're not going to be able to find that pattern or the theme or the thing that you're answering, because I think it's very relevant, especially to, the story and example you just gave.
Yep. I'm going to answer it, but maybe not answer it in full. So one of the great things at Clearleft is, we hire mostly senior people, but we realise that means that there's a kind of a whole sort of group of new designers coming into the market that can't benefit from our experience. So over the last pretty much over the last 10 years, we've been bringing in interns. And so a lot of these interns are straight from university or maybe 1-2 years into their career. And one thing that I have spotted is a really, really common pattern of behavior that I think is incredibly problematic for new designers. And I understand why it's there, but it's a difficult habit to break. And that habit goes back to what we were saying right at the start of the show, which was a desire to jump to the first most obvious solution. And the reason it's there is actually often because of the way teaching happens. Because if you are a student at university, you're probably working on a project on your own or with 1 or 2 other people. You probably have a crazy deadline, deliver this thing in 2 weeks' time. And so what happens is you end up doing research theatre. You end up doing research, you're going out and speaking to people, not because you're really hoping to get the insight or you really understand what you're doing with it, but because your lecturer has told you that this is how good design works. So almost it becomes cargo cult thinking. You go out there, you assemble. You're familiar with cargo cults, are you?
I'm not. Let's.
Oh, okay. So you're now not going to have. You're going to have to like break this episode up into 2 or 3 parts, I think, because you've accidentally fallen into one of my favourite things. So I'm going to go off on a slight tangent here. So cargo cults, basically, towards the end of the war in the Pacific, you had all of these sort of American troops landing on these tropical islands with planes and trucks and boats and cargo. Guns, sweet, Coca-Cola, etc. So all of these kind of islanders had this sudden burst of wealth, but this burst of wealth was beyond their technical knowledge. So they didn't understand how all this stuff worked. As soon as the war finished, all of this wealth and all of these American GIs left. And so the islanders we want to get this wealth back. And so they built bamboo aeroplanes. And they cleared forests and they made sort of bamboo conning towers and pretend airstrips, because they didn't understand how planes and airports and cargo travel worked. So they thought if they built these things, somehow they would summon all these wealth, goods down from the sky. And it's this idea of fixating on the trappings of things, what something looks like, rather than having a deep understanding of how it actually works. And so cargo cult thinking I see happening a lot in design, where people are mimicking what they see other designers doing without truly understanding the mechanisms behind why these things work. So you go out, you talk to a couple of users, you go, check, that's my talking to users bit done. Now I'm going to go off and somehow insight is going to happen. And so I think teaching people actually genuinely good research is important. I also think not rushing people to a solution. So a couple of years ago, we had a team of 3 interns, and we set them a 3-month project to come up with a new product or service that would enrich the lives of the residents of Brighton, where I lived. And they came back to us in the first 3 days, going, "Hey, we've solved it." And we looked at it, and it was like, "Well, that's been done before. It's the most obvious solution. Yada yada yada." And they were really frustrated because the whole of their lives up to that point have basically been about having genius ideas, pleasing their superiors. And when we said, "Well, no, that's not really what we're looking for. Go back and think a little bit more." And so they came back 2 weeks later and they were like, "Well, we've solved the problem." And it was like, "What did you?" "Well, we talked to a couple of people in the street and now we've kind of, we've got the answer." And again, it was really, really shallow. And it took the 3rd time to say, "No, really go and talk to people, really understand the problem, really immerse yourself in the feeling, in the frustration, and spend more time." And, 2-3 weeks later, they came back and they'd got it by that time. And they had really immersed themselves in the problem. They had really understand what was going on. They had genuinely come up with solutions that weren't the most obvious ones. And we sort of forced them to do a bunch of exercises. I think this was a different team now, but one team that was having the same problem. We said, "Okay, go away. And we want you over the course of a week, each one of you, there were 3 of you, to come up with a new design idea every half a day." And so they came back to us a week later and they had 6, 12, 24, 36 designs, ideas. And so they'd cycled through this stuff. And then based on the research, we could look at it and go, "Okay, well, that has some promise, etc., etc., etc." And so doing research theatre and not allowing yourself the time to generate ideas above and beyond the obvious, I think are the biggest risks that designers have. The other thing I think, this is maybe being a bit mean now, but you have all these kids coming out of university who have been told how smart and how clever and how special they are. And then maybe they go into Facebook and they're told that they're even smarter and even clever and even more special. They're so special that you're going to have free massages and you're going to have, free laundry, etc., etc. But they're given really, really kind of tramline problems. If you go and work at Facebook, you've already got a design language created. You've already got component libraries created. You're effectively moving bits and pieces around, and you're being given very, very specific problems. And so this idea of having a really broad problem to tackle and having no kind of scaffolding around can be terrifying. So I see a lot of designers who think they're the bee's knees, 3 years in, and when you actually look at their ability to really truly get into a problem and really truly come up with an innovative solution, they're mediocre at best. So yeah, bathe in the problem, and generate lots of solutions.
That's such a fun story, and that's really, really clever the way that you kind of force those teams to go back out and continuously do that. One of the things that I also really like too is force yourself to come up with a new solution every half a day. It was an exercise I used to do very early in my career in sketching, and where I simply said, and this is actually from another reference back to Adaptive Path, our friends there, Leah Bewley. And so she had come up with this 6-up sketch template, and I used to force myself to come up with 6 different solutions within 15 minutes. And I would actually time box myself. And it didn't matter how similar or how different those 6 were, I had to come up with 6.
Also, I was just going to say, a lot of this comes from, it's a very classic product design school technique called 100 designs. So, on the first day or one of the first days of a product design school, they'll ask their students to create 100 different designs for a chair. And obviously the first 20 or 30 will just be, obvious things they've seen around. The next 20 or 30, they start to get kind of, a little bit stuck. But then they kind of they keep powering through, and then suddenly they start to get wacky and interesting and unusual, and they start to kind of think differently and explore what it means to be a chair. And maybe it doesn't need to sort of follow these kind of, but it's only by expending energy and getting to this point of sort of frustration that you've got rid of all the obvious solutions, that you can end up coming and getting a really interesting one. And so this 100 design process is fairly common, and that's sort of what we adapted with these people. I think we did it, asked them to create something within half a day, partly because this wasn't just something that was a known thing like a chair. It was actually coming up with quite innovative solutions, so they needed to spend a bit more time. But yeah, it perfectly matches with the 6-up, 1-up templates, which we use all the time. I mean, that's a great sort of co-design tool. So when we're doing kind of design thinking type workshops with clients who have no graphic design experience, 6-up, 1-ups are a fantastic way of forcing people, because again, like we see this even more with our clients. Our clients will get fixated on one solution, but then once you force them to kind of cycle through other ideas, they then, after half an hour, they realize why their first solution wasn't the best solution, and why a combination of a bunch of different things that a bunch of different people came up actually solved the problem in a more elegant way. And I think that's one of the challenges is, I hate the idea of educating clients. That feels really patronizing. But I think there's something about allowing clients to experience in a small way the challenges, but also opportunities and insightful moments that design can bring, can mean that when you're having conversations later down the line, they're much more empathetic and much more understanding about what you've gone through, and don't just kind of have these very, very fixed mindsets that this is what I want and why haven't you designed the thing that I specified. So yeah, these exercises can be very powerful.
Sure. Let's take a step back to something that you were saying too about gathering this research information and creating insights, synthesizing it in some way. A couple themes popped up in mind: defining what the problem is, but more importantly, the themes or patterns you find in these conversations are you're forming your definition of what the problem is. It's your job to then go deeper and apply perhaps abductive reasoning to really understand why those themes or patterns exist. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I'd probably largely agree. I mean, I really do value design and design research, and there are when you have a highly optimized solution and it's working really, really well, really, really deep research can help you wring out those extra speed gains. And so in those situations, like having really, really detailed research, I think helps, and having specialist external researchers will be able to uncover insights that there's no way that you could have ever uncovered yourself. On the other hand, my experience is 90% of the things that we get asked to solve are so broken and there's so much low-hanging fruit that it's kind of obvious what's wrong. And in those situations, what I tend to find is, again, like researchers, I don't mean to kind of dismiss researchers, but a lot of researchers I've worked with, a lot of researchers I've seen, have this very kind of deductive kind of process. So they'll see a problem that a user has, they'll immediately come up with a solution that solves that problem, and then they'll present the findings not as understanding what the problem is, but proffering up a solution. But those solutions can often be two-dimensional. The value, I think, is having designers live and experience the frustration and the problem. So you can't get that from reading a report. You can't fully understand what it feels like, the frustration levels that a user has when they're trying to do something in a timely manner and they can't do it, by reading a report that says 7 out of 9 users failed this test. You can only experience it by feeling it, or understand it by feeling it. And so later on down the line, because stories are really, really important. If when you're coming to make a design decision, you've got your research report there and it says like 7 out of 9 people did X, that's not going to kind of hit you in the heart, and it's not going to actually probably make a big input into your design decisions. But when you're looking at this thing and you're like, oh God, yeah, when we saw these people use this, they really, really struggled. That becomes part of the narrative, and that is the thing that kind of empowers the designer to solve that problem. So in some way, and this might sound a bit weird, but I think designers doing their own research is the same as athletes doing their own stretching and warm-up. You can't outsource the warm-up to somebody else. You can't say to your coach, well, look, coach, I'm kind of a bit busy now. You can do all the stretching for me, and you hydrate, and then when you're done, I'll run the marathon. You need to be loose, and you need to kind of have that sort of physical awareness of what the problem is. And I think that's what designers doing research should do. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they should be the only people doing it. And I'm really happy to have the coach along to sort of make sure that we're stretching in the right way, and we're not going to hurt ourselves or do anything inappropriate. And actually, if you've got big teams of people, you need researchers to plan and maybe deliver. But the designers have got to be actively involved, and just reading a PowerPoint deck or a presentation or a report is you can't outsource that insight. So I don't know if that sort of answers your question, and maybe it does a bit.
I think it does, and it added to it. I mean, I think everything that we're touching on is really, yes, as an example of that 7 out of 9 people failed on this thing. That's a theme or a pattern that you might find, but you don't necessarily have a great understanding of why. And even a research report, which is not a great way of communicating research anymore, does not give you that why. And you should be able to feel that and apply your own worldview and experience to be able to apply that understanding of why that pattern existed.
Which is sort of why I think sometimes I'm the only person left in the world that actually still likes personas. I think I'm definitely the only person on Twitter that still actually likes personas, because you open up Twitter and like literally every single day a new thing has suddenly been pronounced dead or useless or worthless. Now, I'm not saying personas are the be or end all. They have their weaknesses and limitations, but I think they're a tool that people are basically using badly and then saying, well, the tool's the problem. And the way I liken it is kind of like, it's like a hammer. If you're doing DIY and all you have is a hammer, then you're probably going to make a mess of like putting up a set of shelves, because you probably need a saw and you probably need a screw or whatever. And so if you go around smashing everything and going, oh, well, hammers are useless, I'm never going to use a hammer again, that's just daft. And I would argue that, actually in DIY, mostly you'd probably be using saws and maybe screws, and hammers are kind of used in only very specific situations, but they are still useful. And I find personas are a good way of encapsulating the stories you've heard and the data you've gathered from your interviews. I'm not interested in any of the demographic information. That's not what personas are there for. The demographic information is mostly to add richness to the memory. And you're stupid if you're making design decisions based on some mythical age or class or income on your personas. That's not what they're there for. But what they're there for is to encapsulate a set of behaviors and a set of user needs, so that when you're thinking about design solutions, you can kind of reflect back on the research you did. And so I still think they have value. The trend at the moment is jobs to be done, which I think is great as well. But I don't think it's necessarily, either or. One is good and one is bad. And I think particularly for organizations that have never been customer centric, personas can still be a useful tool to deliver that customer centricity. And to give you an example, like we recently redesigned our own website, and we eat our dog food. We created personas based on all of the interactions that we'd had with our clients, and we're very quickly able to break down our users into like multiple different types of people, and each one of them needed a very, very different set of information, in a different timely manner. They were looking for different things in their careers, etc., etc. And that massively helped not only the architecture and structure of our site, but also the content strategy. And we would never have been able to do that if we were focused purely on tasks and jobs, and we never would have been able to do that if we were focused purely on like an amorphous user with no kind of distinct personality. And so, I think there are ways that you can utilize design research to help encapsulate that. On the other hand, don't just then go, well, everything we do has to have personas, because that's dumb as well. Everything in moderation.
Yeah, awesome. Say, Andy, this has been a really fantastic conversation, and I want to thank you again for joining us. I know I personally very much enjoyed it, and I think those who are listening will as well. Only other thing I was going to ask you, is there anything in particular with those listening to the episode today?
Thank you. I mean, I've had a blast as well, and as you could probably tell, we could have done another hour. So
I think that's very true.
So do please kind of reach out, and I'd love to kind of have a chat with you at a future episode, maybe when you get to sort of 26 or something, or what have you, in another 30 episodes. The thing I'm working on at the moment, I've just started programming the second edition of our new conference. So I run a bunch of conferences. I run a conference called UX London, which is in 3 weeks' time. It's not a plug because the tickets have sold out. But the reason I kind of run conferences is often because I want to help push the industry forward. In fact, I think the whole purpose of Clearleft has been to kind of try and advance the community and the practice. So we advance the quality of digital design through the design work we do. We advance it through the client interactions and helping the client staff we work with. And a lot of our design work these days, as I probably said earlier, is actually going in and working alongside teams and coaching them and training them. And we do it through our blog posts and our talks and our books, etc. And also we do it through, our conferences. And, with a client engagement, I can maybe help, 10 clients a year. With a conference like UX London, I can maybe help 200 designers. And if those 200 designers then help 10 other clients, then suddenly you've got thousands and thousands of people that you're helping and pushing forward. My latest endeavor has basically come out of having conversations with people like you, frankly, conversations on podcasts, conversations over coffee and at conferences, where I've spoken to friends of mine that started off as bloggers and designers, and then they maybe had a small team of people they managed, and then they had a bigger team of people they managed, and then they were running a department, and then maybe they were, people like Peter Merholtz, who's now like, vice president of X or whatever. I don't actually know what Peter's doing right at this second, but previously he was vice president of design at Groupon, and he's done various other things since. I think he's at Capital One now. And all of these people had similar stories. They'd moved into management, and they were trying to figure out how to restructure their orgs to allow more space for design, how to create the right culture for design, how to hire the right people, how to manage up, manage down, look after the growth of their teams. Like, there's so many roles that designers have. And then you've got kind of new emerging disciplines like design ops, which is all around how to turn design into a really optimized system. And you tend to have design ops in very, very large organizations like Airbnb, where design is operating at such a high scale. You need operational people to kind of make sure that it's working as efficiently and friction-free as possible. So last year I set up a new conference called Leading Design, which was in London in October at the Barbican, which is a fantastic historic design venue. And it was an absolute blast. We had Mike Davidson, one of my friends who was ex-VP of Twitter. We had Rochelle from VP of Design at Spotify, and a whole bunch of other really, really smart people. Many of them you would just wish that you'd had them as a boss, like at some stage. And they just kind of shared, and it was a really open, honest conversation about some of the struggles and the challenges. There was advice, but also there was like self-care information. It can be quite tough being a boss when you're the only person of your kind in your team, and you're struggling with kind of how to deal with day-to-day work. And so that was good. And so the next one is happening in the UK in October. We had a whole bunch of people from the US and Europe fly out, so it's not just a British thing. Tickets aren't available yet, but if you go to leadingdesign.org, I think, or maybe leadingdesign.com, I should know this information. Just type Leading Design in your favorite browser search engine, and it will pop up. And yeah, if you're in a space where you're managing anybody more than one person, or even if you want to get into management, that would be quite a good thing to come to. And particularly if you or any of your listeners know of any great design leaders, maybe people that they've worked under and they've really admired, who have given them some great advice, please ask them to ping me the details at Andy Budd on Twitter. And I'm always looking for amazing speakers, particularly speakers of colour, or particularly speakers that come from less sort of backgrounds that have less sort of visibility. Then please sort of point them in my direction, and I'd love to kind of have a chat.
Once again, Andy, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a real blast.
Likewise, Zach. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome. And then that'll be all she wrote.
Brilliant. That was good. I enjoyed that.
If you enjoyed this episode, consider leaving us a rating on iTunes or wherever it is that you listen to our podcast. And also, you can fill out our podcast survey, where you can let us know if someone awesome that we should have on the show, and even tell us about the things you would want to hear about, topics that are interesting for you. You can check that out in the show notes or on our website. Thanks for listening to Aurelia's podcast, talking about product strategy and design strategy. We are the first platform of its kind to help you solve the right problems for your customers and your business and build products and services that truly matter. You can check us out at aureliuslab.com. That is www.aureliuslab.com. You can check us out on Twitter at aureliuslab and Instagram Aurelius Lab. We'll see you next time.